I want to play Bishop Reginald Jackson's sound from yesterday, and then he's getting specific about what companies need to do if this is now a moment of choosing. Let me play that, and we'll talk about this on the other side.
We cannot support companies who support or remain silent about legislation that is based on a lie, that seeks to suppress our vote, is racist, and seeks to turn back time to Jim Crow. There is no way that these companies did not know that this legislation was based on a lie. I am pleased with their public comments. Let me also say that it is a little too late. They had the opportunity to speak out against this legislation some time ago. And I cannot help but believe that it was not until we talked about a boycott that they said we have to do something.
That was from this morning, and he is absolutely right. We have been looking for comments from these companies, and it was not until, I believe, Stacey Abrams 2 weeks ago raised the specter of pressure on Georgia companies that they finally issued these almost identically worded statements yesterday.
Right, Nicole. And here's the thing. There's also history of this, right? We have the famous story of Coca-Cola putting pressure on white business people in the 1960s because they were initially going to boycott Martin Luther King getting his Nobel Peace Prize in the city. Businesses can have an influence on this level of politics. And I'm one of the people, I spoke to Latasha Brown for Black Voters Matter. We did a whole interview about this on my podcast. Every single bit of pressure needs to be focused on Georgia because symbolically that does end up affecting other places. This state has become ground zero for these issues. If it gets knocked down, if big businesses, if Delta and Coca-Cola and everybody else symbolically say you need to stop this here, other states will be more nervous. And here's the thing, Nicole, what can these businesses do? They can pull back pledge money. They could ask Republican candidates in particular or Republican sitting officials, we want our $5,000, we want our $10,000 back. Athletes can also get involved of these teams. We saw, ask Kelly Loeffler if athletes make a difference one way or another in a state. She literally lost her team over her politics. I would love to see, if Georgia wants to make a law that says you can't give people water in line when they're waiting to vote, I would love to see Matt Ryan, the quarterback of the Falcons, LeBron James, show up in a big Gatorade truck. Oh, we can't give water? We got some Gatorade here for everybody in line. Like, there's things that can be done here, and I think it'll spread throughout the rest of the country if Georgia becomes a place where these laws are pushed back.
Well, and Mike Barnacle, let's be clear about why all eyes are on sports, all eyes are on corporate America, because the Republican Party is a failed state. The Republican Party does not believe in access to voting rights. They're now taking a lie that led to a deadly insurrection and using that lie to roll back access to the polls. And I'm old enough to remember when Republicans liked people being able to mail in their ballots. That's not today's Republican Party, but I want to go through where corporate America is today. This is a list of companies that have called for action against voting restrictions in the wake of the Georgia bill: Cisco, American Express, Apple, B of A, Microsoft, BlackRock, Merck, Viacom, JP Morgan Chase, Google, Coca-Cola. Here's Tim Cook's statement, head of Apple, quote, "The right to vote is fundamental in a democracy. American history is the story of expanding the right to vote to all citizens, and Black people in particular have had to march, struggle, and even give their lives for more than a century to defend that right. Apple believes that thanks in part to the power of technology, it ought to be easier than ever for every eligible citizen to exercise their right to vote. We support efforts to ensure that our democracy's future is more hopeful and inclusive than its past." Why doesn't big business in America get behind a push in the opposite direction? And that's to say, not just defending against these laws, but why not have corporate America push for voting on our phones?
You know, Nicole, that's a very good question. But the root of it, all of it, lies in something that began in the summer and fall of 2016 and thrived for the following 4 years after the election of the former guy. And that's the roots of fear that he injected into our politics and our culture. So now corporate America is the same as an average citizen in a sense. They have a fear of the backlash against a statement they might make.
Yeah.
They have a fear of losing profits, as many people. Look what's happened to this country. We have people who have a fear of masks, a fear of vaccines, a fear of the other all the time. That has thrived in this nation over the last 4 years. And as much attention as we pay to it, we don't pay enough attention to it.
So say more.
Well, I mean, you can see it. You can see it in the normal course of conversations that people have. I mean, people were afraid to say things to someone they barely know for fear that there'll be a backlash against them. That's on an individual basis. But there's also this thriving market of fear that goes from state to state to state. You know, well, we could cut down on the virus if you'd wear the mask. Wear the mask. Oh, no, I'm not wearing a mask. I'm not wearing a mask because you're afraid that your peers might say something to you. The people you play cards with on a Friday night, all of whom voted for Trump or maybe didn't vote for Trump, but liked the way he talked, liked the way he verbalized their fears of the changing America that we're all a part of. And never underestimate the fear of change in this country. We're late to get to it. It's tough for many people to handle, but it's a fact of life in 2022, as it was a fact of life in 1902 and 1922, when immigrants started arriving on these shores hand over fist. I mean, my parents were immigrants. There was a fear of their parents when they arrived here because they were Irish Catholic and came from a different country and practiced a different religion. So fast forward 110 years, 115 years, and America is still so susceptible to this fear. And it's predominantly prevalent among people who wear skin like I wear today.
So, Jason, I think what Mike just did was strip this down to the real world. And what's happening in the real world is that fear is driving support for bills like this. That fear is letting companies that without the scrutiny, without the spotlight, stay silent until days and days and days of scrutiny forces them to speak up and speak out and land on the right side. But I guess my question is, it is pervasive, and Mike just ticked through a couple things. I'd add vaccine hesitancy. It's fear of whatever. I don't know I think the right-wing legend goes that Bill Gates has got their, I don't know what it is, but there is fear of vaccine. I mean, it is so prevalent. How does a win against this Georgia voter suppression law, this law that will have the effect of suppressing the vote, how does that fuel and animate the push against fear?
Well, I don't know if it does, Nicole, because the fear has always been unfounded, right? The fear is, you know, some part of racism is fear, but other parts of racism, you just feel like you're better than everybody else. The reason that the white people who were here before didn't like the Irish white people who came over later is because they thought they were better. The reason the white people in America didn't like the Italians when they came over is because they thought they were better. The reason that, you know, certain types of Asian Americans don't like other Asian Americans, Latinos, all of this racism is sometimes based on fear, but sometimes it's just based on a sense of superiority. And when people are operating, whether from fear or a sense of superiority, the only thing you can do is beat them. You can't make somebody less afraid. I can't walk down the street, no matter how charming and considerate I may be, I can't change a bigot's opinion of me, no matter what I do, no matter what I say, no matter how I behave. All I can do is either avoid that person or keep them from harming me and people who look like me. So stopping this bill or convincing people that, hey, if Stacey Abrams becomes your governor, she's not going to take your guns and enslave white people, that's not going to change Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's not going to change anybody in QAnon. So rather than changing people who want to operate off of fear and bigotry, we just have to move past them. We have to move past them just like sexists and bigots and homophobes and everything else like that, because we can't wait. This country can't afford to wait to change people's minds or make them less afraid of things they never should have been afraid of to begin with.
Aaron Haynes, I'll give you the last word. What happens next in Georgia?
Well, you know, I think, Nicole, what I would say is that, yes, what you also have is that the fear of speaking out, the fear of doing something and getting involved has started to become overtaken by the fear of not speaking out, by not doing something. You're seeing athletes that didn't think that they needed to weigh in on these kinds of issues suddenly weighing in on these issues. The NBA All-Star game that was in Atlanta, you had athletes focusing on voter suppression. Now you have, you know, President Biden and his campaign asking this country, is this who we are? Is this who we want to be as a country? And many white Americans saying, no, this is not who we want to be. This is not who I am. Speaking up, speaking out, taking action, and saying that injustice and inequality is not something that they want to be associated with. And then you have these Black business icons, right, who, made that dramatic statement. These are not people who normally, want the spotlight, who are normally drawing attention to themselves on these types of issues, but they know that their wealth and stature does not insulate them, from discrimination or from weighing in on these issues. And so the message here is being in the room, having a platform really means nothing if you're not going to use your voice once you're at the table.
And that seems to be the common thread. Erin Haynes, thank you for starting us off. My dear friend Mike Barnacle, thank you for sticking around this late in the day to be on TV. Jason is sticking around with us.
I knew how he felt. It's so hard to lose a parent.
Prosecutors asked her to go into detail about their mutual struggle with opioid addiction, a story that'll no doubt resonate with countless Americans.
We both suffered from chronic pain. Mine was in my neck and his was in his back. We got addicted and tried really hard to break that addiction many times.
And over how long of a period did this struggle go on for you, for both of you?
Addiction, in my opinion, is a lifelong struggle. So it's something that we dealt with every day.
During cross-examination, Chauvin's attorneys focused on Floyd's addiction, bringing up an overdose that took place months before his death. And it all appears to be part of what may turn out to be a key plank of Chauvin's defense, this argument that the substances in Floyd's body on the day of the incident contributed to his death. Her testimony was followed by a series of first responders who described a harrowing scene and a frantic rush on their part to try to treat Floyd. One paramedic telling the jury that he thought Floyd was already dead when they arrived, and said that there was no reason the police officers couldn't have started doing chest compressions to try to revive him. Another paramedic testified that officers remained on top of Floyd while a partner was checking for a pulse. Floyd was not moving or breathing.
I was standing a little ways away, so I couldn't get my partner would have a more accurate description of his condition at that point, but from what I could see where I was at, I didn't see any breathing or movement or anything like that.
Joining our conversation, NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster, live for us in Minneapolis once again. Also joining us, Shauna Lloyd, a wrongful death and civil rights attorney, and Jason Johnson still here. Shaq, I watched a lot of this, and I still do not understand how and why, not just Derek Chauvin, but why all the police officers were physically restraining a man who wasn't moving or breathing.
It makes you get a sense of the frustration that you saw from the bystanders that we heard from the past 3 days of testimony. Today, it shifted a little bit. We didn't hear from those main bystanders. We heard from the girlfriend of George Floyd, someone who knew him extremely well, who started her testimony and became emotional almost instantly, talking about their first dates, talking about his love for sports, and also talking about their struggles with opioids, how she deals with chronic neck issues. George Floyd suffered from chronic back problems as well, and that led into an opioid epidemic, an opioid addiction, rather. That opened a door somewhat for the defense to make one of their main points, which is the fact that George Floyd had drugs in his system. But you go to the point of the officers being over George Floyd in those final moments, and the testimony that we heard from the paramedics really drove in that point you were making, where the paramedics said when they pulled up, the officers were still over him, and when they saw George Floyd on the ground, they saw a man who did not have a heartbeat. They saw a man who did not have a pulse. They saw a man who was not breathing. They say that condition never changed from the point that he arrived on the ambulance to when he arrived at the hospital and then was pronounced dead. So you really get a sense that the prosecution is trying to get ahead of what they know the defense will be talking about, which is that drug use will be the drugs in his system. But you also get a sense that the prosecution wants to lay out that the fact that George Floyd, for all intents and purposes, was dead as he still had a knee in his neck.
Shauna, what is the role of presenting Derek Chauvin as depraved play in all this?
It's important because when you look at what the charges, the jury is going to be charged with determining at what point he intended to do any harm. If they're looking at murder 2, they're going to be looking at if he intended to commit grave bodily harm. So that's going to be very important. Or whether or not it was a reckless act that endangered someone. That would be murder 3. So those are going to play into and become very nuanced conversations that the jury is going to have when they're looking at the actual charges.
And Shauna, it just seems to me that if, and again, covering this, I think I look at the evidence the way a jury must look at it. I don't know any of the individuals. I know most of what I know about this story from Shaq's extraordinary reporting. But what juror hears from eyewitness after eyewitness who is today, last night and tonight, struggling and traumatized with guilt that they didn't do more to save George Floyd? And then hears from paramedics who got there, and basically my sense of the testimony today is that by the time they arrived, there was nothing they could do. How is that not clearly depraved treatment on the part of Derek Chauvin?
I think that's what the defense is going to be trying to show, is that it isn't. I think it's going to be very hard. This is a case unlike any other that we've seen before, where we have so many witnesses, so many have backgrounds that speak to this very ability to tell whether or not someone is conscious or unconscious. You know, the 911 operator, we have also the EMT, we have an MMA fighter. These are people that could notice and would be very well aware of when someone has passed into unconscious behavior. And so he being there and being unconscious, the officers on top of him should have been aware that he went from being active to unconscious to possibly being dead before the paramedics got there. That's significant.
Jason, what's on your mind with today's testimony?
So it's disturbing on 2 levels. And look, I've said this, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to play one on TV, but the entire defense relies upon something that doesn't make any sense and is offensive to anyone's common sense from what you've seen today. The defense's argument is basically he had so many drugs in his system that he would have died that day anyway, even if Derek Chauvin hadn't put a knee on his neck. And every single time you see a witness, every single time you see someone who humanizes George Floyd, every single time you see an EMT say, yeah, this is ridiculous, it makes it more and more clear how depraved and terrible the behavior was. But I'll say this, Nicole, I have my students live tweeting the trial. They're live tweeting it now. They've been live tweeting it all throughout the week. And I think what takes me back when I read their view, when I see some of the witness testimony today, is this is probably one of the few times where we've ever had one of these trials where as much as the defense wants to make this a trial about George Floyd, he has been humanized in a way. He has been empathized with in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime for a black person who was killed by the police. People are crying. People are talking about what a good boyfriend he was. People are confused. People are guilt-ridden by his death. And as terrible as I think this whole situation is, and as much as I think that Derek Chauvin is eventually going to be found guilty as a sacrificial lamb and a make-up call, but it won't do anything about our overall justice system, I'm at least somewhat mollified by the fact that we didn't see hours and hours of testimony trying to tear this man down who's already given up the greatest thing he could give up, which is his life, so that somebody else can actually learn something and maybe make some changes in the future in this country.
Shaq, to Shauna and Jason's point about what the legal questions will center around for this jury, what they'll at the end of this be asked to make a determination of, it is this question of how George Floyd died. And yesterday I likened it to the COVID deaths. People can't, sometimes people on the right try to say, oh, they had pre-existing conditions. 545,000 Americans died of COVID, not pre-existing conditions or old age. This is the statement about George Floyd's drug use and addiction, which was, again, we should point out to our viewers, presented by the prosecution in this strategy of pulling this out and telling it in their own words. Let me read the Floyd family statement. As the defense attempts to construct the narrative that George Floyd's cause of death was the fentanyl in his system, we want to remind the world who witnessed his death on video that George Floyd was walking, talking, laughing, and breathing just fine before Derek Chauvin held his knee to George's neck, blocking his ability to breathe and extinguishing his life for all to see. Tens of thousands of Americans struggle with self-medication and opioid abuse and are treated with dignity, respect, and support, not brutality. We fully expected the defense to put George's character and struggles with addiction on trial because that's the go-to tactic when the facts are not on your side. Do you have, I know you're getting the pool reports from the courtroom, but between the family statement and the testimony today, do you have a sense that the prosecution feels like they did what they set out to do today in terms of framing his past drug use and his drug use on that day in their own terms?
I think that's something we have to evaluate in the long term because we're not really hearing much from the prosecution outside of what they're doing in court. I will say in terms of what we're seeing in court and what we're hearing from the reporters that are in there, remember, just 2 reporters, so we're relying on their accounts, you get a sense that this is very disturbing stuff for some of the jury. I mean, if you're watching this trial, if you've been watching this trial throughout the day on MSNBC, I can tell you that you are not really seeing many of the images. There are some images that we've been seeing play in court, some of those exhibits that are truly graphic, that will scar many people, that we have done a good job of not showing and not exposing our viewers to that. But the jury is seeing that. And there's one point where the poll reporter expresses one juror, she says, has her hand covering her mouth while watching the video of George Floyd being rolled over onto the stretcher and then placed onto the ambulance. You see another account where it says all jurors are watching the video. All of them stop taking notes as they watch some of the video of George Floyd trying to be resuscitated by some of the paramedics. It gets really graphic in that courtroom, and I think when people see those images, and especially you have these jurors who, you know, some of them in jury questioning express concern about having to look at some of those graphic images, it's something that will definitely touch them. Whether or not, you know, what that means in terms of the legal aspect of it, I think that remains to be seen. Remember, we still have a whole, we still have the defense that needs to bring their arguments forward. They have their own witnesses, and they'll have their own accounts that they'll make.
Shauna, let me just give you the last word. Can you take us inside what you would be thinking if you were on either side? What would you be thinking at this point in the day if you were on the prosecutor's team, and what would you be thinking if you were on the defense team?
If you're on the defense team, you're going to be assessing the damage. You're assessing the emotional impact that these statements are making, that these witnesses are making. But you're always going to have to take a very gentle road with dealing with these type of witnesses because they are emotionally charged. So you don't want to alienate the jury. So they're going to be looking to bring up the facts, just like he did with George Floyd's girlfriend. He's going to bring out the fact that, yes, there was illegal drug use. He had had an overdose, but you have to do it teasingly. You're going to see a very big difference, I think, when he begins calling witnesses, because right now it is the prosecution's case. When you're looking from the side of the prosecution, you're looking at framing everything that they hear from this point after, from the view of the testimony that we've heard so far, from the view of the bystanders, from the view of the paramedics. You want, even the girlfriend did a very good job in humanizing George and their struggle, as so many Americans are struggling with this opioid crisis. So it's humanized him. And so everything you hear thereafter is going to be put into that framework. And that's the structure of the way they're going to continue presenting information.
NBC's Shaquille Brewster and Shauna Lloyd, thank you both so much for joining our coverage. Jason's sticking around. It's another sidebar. Jason Johnson, I cut you off when you were making a salient point that became all the more salient about how all of these witnesses saw the same thing, someone who had done harm, done something wrong.
Right. And he's sort of, you can see where the prosecutor is certainly taking him down this path of like, okay, did you think that was force? Was it force on the ground? How can we define force? Why were you concerned about this person if it was just a regular arrest? What they're laying out is that Derek Chauvin's behavior can't be considered normal, that it'll fall outside of the bounds of training, that there was nothing about the circumstance. Yes, Chauvin will say, I thought the people were a little hostile, but you notice the other officer says, yeah, we'll gather them up anyway. So clearly the other officer didn't think that the other people around appeared to be presenting any sort of immediate danger to Chauvin. So that's what they want to lay out, that this guy did something that was wrong. His training knew better, his colleagues knew better, the witnesses knew better, everybody knew better, and he still did what he wanted, which resulted in George Floyd dying.
There's also an interesting sort of chain of a new timeline in when his supervisor learned the facts of the case. This witness, we came to him a second late. I want to tell everybody who this is. This is David Ploger. He recently retired as a sergeant from the Minneapolis Police Department, but at the time of the killing of George Floyd, he was Derek Chauvin's boss. He says that he did not learn about the knee on George Floyd's neck until he got to the hospital. There was that photo either entered into evidence or was already in that was brought up. I wonder, too, if you take the sort of different vantage points that the prosecution is presenting to this jury, and you pulled Shauna's point earlier, that they've presented it from the eyewitnesses who were just there by a twist of fate. They've presented it from the humans closest to him, his girlfriend. They've presented it from the emergency medical responders, one off duty, and then the officials who responded and saw the same thing. And now from Chauvin's own boss, they all saw the same thing, Jason.
Yeah, and Nicole, like, you could not ask, as a prosecutor, you couldn't ask for a better collection of witnesses. Nurses, EMTs, coworkers, MMA fighters. I mean, this is literally a collection. This isn't just sort of a jury or witnesses of your peers. These are all people who have a specific level of expertise, and it's not like they were set up that way. They all happen to witness this same heinous kind of behavior. But I also think it's important because when we're talking about a supervisor, we're talking about somebody who also knows Derek Chauvin's behavior, who also would be familiar with how this man was trained, who'd also be familiar with how he behaves overall. And so, again, I'm caught up on this moment where he's like, yeah, I thought these people were hostile. I still said, talk to him. You know, implication, look, I know Derek. I know he's going to say everybody's hostile when he goes about doing his job. So I found that to be compelling as well. If you tell your boss, oh, gosh, you know, the customers in the restaurant are terrible today, yeah, get back out there. It's because he knows who he's dealing with. And so I think all of these things they're not just training issues and witness issues. They also become character references about who Officer Chauvin actually was at that day.